So obviously, the holes in most plastic canvas are just way too big for you to be able to tie a knot in your yarn to start stitching. So here's how you start a strand of yarn. Let's come up through the corner of this piece of canvas, and we're going to leave a tail of yarn at the back. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 inches is fine. And we're going to hold it right along the edge of the canvas there with the same hand that's holding the canvas for stitching, right? Now, I'm just going to start a simple little slant stitch. I'm going to stitch my row here in the direction of that leading tail of yarn. And with each stitch, as you can hopefully see, I'm catching that leading tail that I'm holding there. So that as I make my way down this row little by little, I'm covering up that initial piece of yarn, and it'll be completely invisible by the time it's all covered up. Neat, huh? This applies no matter what kind of stitch you're going to do. So here I'm starting a row of, continental stitch or tent stitch, the standard little needlepoint stitch. Same thing, I'm going to leave a little tail at the back and hold it there at the edge. I'm going to stitch in the direction of that tail of leading yarn, and in this case my little stitches are covering it up. You have to be a little more careful with small stitches to make sure that you're catching that leading yarn in them, but it works exactly the same way. And here we're going to stitch actually all the way to the end of that leading tail so you can see how completely it disappears. Now, even if you're going to stitch on one of the plastic canvas shapes, it's exactly the same technique. So here I'll start stitching at the center, and I'll set up my tail of yarn at the back. You can really position that anywhere you need to. In this case, I'm going to hold it as kind of a diagonal. And I'm going to stitch this little star in rows going back and forth. So as you can see, not every stitch I make is catching that leading tail. That's not a problem because each time I get to the end of one of these rows, I'm going to make a stitch that catches my initial tail, and when I start the row after it, I'm going to make another stitch that catches the initial tail. And eventually, by the time I've stitched this whole little section of the star, I'll have covered up that leading tail. So you can place the leading tail anywhere at the back that you're going to be stitching over at some point. As long as you catch that in your stitches and bury it, you're covered. So what happens when your yarn starts to get a little short? Well, then you're going to have to tie it off and start a new strand. I usually like to do that when I have just 3 to 4 inches left on my strand. It's way easier to end thread when you have a little bit of leeway. So what I'll do is here on the back of the canvas, I'll just pass the needle underneath several stitches and pull the yarn through that and then cut it off close to the work. Same thing applies if I'm doing tiny stitches like this continental stitch. Here on the back of the work you can see that with tiny stitches that go backward and forward in rows, sometimes you end up with really small stitches at the back of the canvas. It's actually really hard to get a needle through those, but next to it is a row of slightly larger stitches which you can wiggle a needle through pretty easily. Or if you happen to have a row of larger stitches that's right next to where you've just been stitching, you can even take advantage of those. Pass your needle under there. Either option is perfectly legal.